and welcome to Manned Up Conversations, where we connect with evolving men to discuss issues around masculinity and manhood, and also provide tools to help us be better for our society.
So there's always something there. So participation is far more important than excellence. We can pursue excellence within that particular space. We can want to get things right within that particular space, but that's not the most important thing. Right? So learning from those cultures, from the hip hop culture, from the African cultures, from the artistic expressions of African cultures, it always comes down to inclusion, diversity, participation, creativity, and expression. How that is done is not really very important. In African music, everywhere, everyone is considered a musician. So African music does not consider virtuosos. Right? Everyone participates. When you are at a music performance, you can participate either as an observer. An observer is a participant, either by clapping your hands, or stomping your feet, or singing whatever voice that you're able to add to the singing. So there's always participation at multiple levels.
Today I traveled all the way out in Boksburg, man. I'm sitting in as you can see behind me, for the guys who are on the audio, you'll get to see it eventually, man. But we're in a beautiful studio, in a very therapeutic space, in a healing space. I feel very calm myself being in here. I told Dr. Nsamu that, man, when I walked in here, I was like, I feel like I'm in school, man. I'm a kid again, right? But before I get too wrapped up in how I'm feeling being here, man, Dr. Nsamu, welcome.
Thank you. Welcome. It's lovely to meet you again.
Yes, man. This is a second of our meetups. We met up on an interview. We're talking about the matrix of fatherhood, something like that on Power FM, right?
Actually, a little correction. This is the third meeting. We first met on Twitter Spaces.
Come on.
Well, we were discussing pretty much the same thing.
Yes,
I think on the Twitter Spaces we were discussing something about the psychology of men or something to that effect.
Oh yes, I remember that. So okay, so we've been meaning to have this conversation. So for welcoming me into your space, man, I really appreciate it.
It actually makes a huge difference that you came all the way into my space. As an African man, from an African sensibility, it's wonderful for me to practice my hospitality with you. And it is a kind of hospitality that I'm hoping that we can practice and exercise towards each other, not just the physical hospitality, but the hospitality of mind, the hospitality of thought, the hospitality of feelings, and that's important for us, especially in the landscape that we inhabit, the spaces that we inhabit as men, as African men.
Man, I don't think we've had a welcome like that since we started. So you can already tell this is going to be an interesting conversation. I mean, Dr. Nsamu, before we even switched on our microphones, I was like dying. I'm like, man, I wish we had the mics on, right? And you're speaking on something right now about our hospitality, and not that being in welcoming you into your home, but also welcoming you to a conversation, being able to see another person. Yeah. Do you see that kind of dwindling away from us as a culture, as a people?
Yes, sadly so, because of so many influences, right? Every culture is an amalgamation of multiple cultures, and sometimes there's stuff gained and then there's stuff lost in the process of amalgamation, in the process of a culture transforming itself, and during the interaction of cultures, right? So there's no one single culture. There's always a hybridity of cultures, and within that hybridization, things get lost. Yeah. And that's where sometimes there has to be curators of culture. Because if we don't have designated curators or people that they themselves have decided they're going to be curators of cultures, a lot of stuff gets lost. They slip through the cracks of hybridization. And hospitality is one of those cultures that, on the one hand, one of those practices that, on the one hand, we aspire for, and two, but we don't really have people that are intentional about holding the value and the practice of hospitality in our culture.
Man. And that's something I feel like that's taught at home, right? When someone visits, when someone is there at our home, or we know we're expecting a guest, a visitor, or someone we haven't seen in a long time, we prepare for that, right? We make sure that, all the best dishes are out, the best food is cooked for that person. And that's part of that hospitality, right? So I kind of feel like that's taught in the home. But now, when we're talking about this is dwindling away, we no longer have that so much in our society because of, you used a very specific word that you said, hybridization. How does that now get lost, man? How does that teaching not translate through the ages like it kind of used to?
Quite a few factors. One of the factors, Kagelo, is that we have shifted from a person-centered economy and economic interactions to a monetary-based economy. And so, coming from you made a good point there about when we were taught at home how to welcome visitors. Just the mere fact of the delight at seeing a visitor when uncle comes home, the spontaneous delight that we express when they arrive at home. And remember, we come from a time when arrivals were not announced. And when you see somebody from a distance, the spontaneous delight that is expressed, right, at being visited. First of all, the honor of being invited to be a host. So hospitality has got two facets here. There's the invitation to practice as a host, to exercise hostessness, right? And then being a guest. So hospitality's got these two factors, right? Being a host and being a guest. So first of all, when somebody comes to your space, into your space, you're being invited to be a host, and they become a guest. So imagine that moment of delight when you are invited to be a host. It's an honor, right? It's an honor to be invited to be a host, as much as it is to be a guest when you are called upon to be a guest, right? So, because we have shifted away from a person-centered economy that delights in seeing people honor you with the invitation to be a guest, our focus on money and the cost, the financial cost of being a host has taken over.
Come on.
So we're no longer delighting in somebody walking into my space.
Sure.
At the moment, we're so obsessed with the cost, the financial cost of being a host, as opposed to the joy, the delight that we get for being invited to be a host.
Man, I love it, man. I was listening to something recently, in this week actually, and this man giving a lecture from somewhere in the 80s, but he spoke about when the economics change, then the family structure also changes. And that's actually what you just said there, right? Is now we're too worried about, hey man, if I give away like my last loaf of bread, then what the hell are we gonna eat? Now where is this person going? Now we gotta take care of this person. We have to feed this person and all of these things. And that takes away like our humanness, right? That Ubuntu factor that we talk about is
100%.
It's been destroyed by, call it capitalism, for lack of a better example. So, you talk about culture and I guess making culture or providing solutions that are culturally appropriate.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you talk about something that's culturally appropriate for that type of situation, but how do we even rectify that? You know.
So not all is lost at the moment, and this is why we have to celebrate people that are intentional about harvesting from the legacy of our culture. So there's still aspects within the milieu, the current environment, that speak to us about what is still possible from African cultures.
Right.
You know, so not all is lost. We still have. And this is the redemptive aspect to academia, right? So we still have academics that are interested. There's a growing body of work within African informed theories and critical theories and decolonial theories at all levels that are inviting us to look again at what is still in the rubbles. Or, you know, what is still in the embers? What is still in the ashes of African cultures? Can we still look at what is there and see if there's stuff that we can harvest from there, right? And for me, that is redemptive. So not all is lost. And I'm one of those that is interested in doing scholarship through the African lens. Right, and this is informed not through the top-down theories, but this is informed by the ground-up theories from practice-based theories, practice-based and observational theories, as opposed to inductive theories and interpretive theories. Sure. So there's still a lot that we can learn from the cultures. This is not about let us go back to the way things were kind of thing. No, this is about what are the best practices that we can still rely upon to inform our social innovation, to inform our indigenous innovation about things that can make us better people, that can make us create better societies. Our hearts know these societies are possible because we do recognize the failure of certain dominant theories and approaches, right? We recognize it because our hearts know what is possible, right? So we can harvest from the best practices, from the best theories, from the best learnings of African theories to move us forward, not just as African societies, but as a global society.
Man, I love it, man. And you know, I will stick to the African part a bit more, because when I read about men, African men that I learn about are very much like marginalized, right? They're not being told in the brightest of light. They're not being celebrated in the most prestigious way, right? There's not much you can see in them and be like, man, I want to be like that guy, right? Well, it's more like a divisive, more like we're subtracting more than we want to add to that experience. So for a South African man like myself, an African child growing up right now, looking at history, and as you're saying, we have to go back, right? So we have to go look at evolutionary psychology, for example, to see, well, what informs the modern man how to be. We can't just talk about the modern man without looking at
100%.
the man from before, right? So with the lack of examples of black men who did great historical stuff, who moved societies forward, who fought, who protected, who were vulnerable, who were all of the things that we're hearing in today's language that we don't really associate with black people. Right? How do you see that playing out in terms of us growing up now, looking for like some kind of identity as a black man?
That's an interesting question. The current world record holder for long jump, I think, is an African guy. What's his name? From Botswana. Right?
Oh, wow. Okay.
So maybe we can find his name and put it to the notes.
We'll definitely do that.
To the notes and to this. The reason I'm raising that, it's a beautiful metaphor for learning and for innovation. If we want to innovate, it's important for us to understand where we're coming from. So if you want to take a long jump, it's important to take so many steps backwards. Right?
Literally.
So literally, you have to take so many steps backwards so that you can build momentum on the distance that you have created. And distance does help us to see not just the length, but it also helps us to see the breadth of knowledge. So as African men, as African people, we need to go back and understand where we have come from, the best practices that we have learned from, right? The current landscape, unfortunately, is not very helpful for us to have healthy conversations around creating a society that we want. So there are 4 dominant approaches to current conversations around men. One, the first dominant approach is shame, name and shame approach. And that's not very helpful because what is happening is that we continue to beat and batter men, and we call men all sorts of names. And so that's not very helpful in terms of what we want to create. So rather than, I've got a proposal when I'm finished naming the landscape of conversation at the moment that are not very helpful. So that's the one, the name and shame is not very helpful. The corresponding approach to that is obviously to every action, there's an equal opposite reaction. So what is happening is that the men fold and they retain their honest thoughts about themselves. So we go inwards in a defensive mode. So men tend to fold under attack. So that's the second one, the second approach. So it is created by this particular approach of name and shame. So we fold and regress. And when that doesn't happen, brings the third approach, which is counterattack, which is very reactive. So the men then will go on and say, well, we're not like that, and you know. So we tend to have this very reactive response to the conversation that is given.
Man.
So that's, you can see how those 3 approaches are not very helpful. And the fourth approach to the conversation that we are having now with men is almost a tendency to want to feminize men. So that's not also very helpful. So these 4 approaches are not very helpful for us to have helpful and productive, effective conversations that drive us towards social innovation, towards a hybrid nature of creating. We're talking about creating a society that we want here, right? So those 4 approaches, in my opinion, are not very helpful. So they're very reactive. They're attack, react, defend, and counterattack. Now, it's very difficult to have a conversation in an environment that is like that because it elicits all kinds of unhelpful emotions. Right?
Yeah.
So So we can't have a conversation that way. We can't have a conversation among ourselves as men because even among ourselves as men, we're all reacting to something.
Exactly.
So even those of us that are proponents of men having conversations, sometimes we get caught in that environment because there's so many stray bullets, emotionally speaking and intellectually speaking. Another approach that is not very helpful is that most of our approaches at the moment are very cognitive. So we're inviting men to introspect. We're inviting men to think about their nature of masculinities. It's all very cognitive, right? So let's all sit here and reflect on ourselves. You know, men, check yourselves kind of approach. But that also comes from the same attack approach, right? So it fits into this general approach towards conversations that we have that are cognitively laden and cognitively informed conversations. So this idea of introspection that is driven by hyper intellectualism is not very helpful either, right? So what then do we have as an option? Back to the conversation of African practice. A lot of the African practices that we can draw upon are around 1, gathering, 2, storytelling, 3, dance in circles. And what do these have in common? If we go to some cultures that are very matriarchal and matrilineal, and there are so many of them, we can go to the San people and learn the best practices from the San people when they gather around a fire in the evening. They are not cognizing. They're not intellectualizing. They are singing and dancing the moon into setting. They are singing and dancing. And when we gather around a dance circle, our awareness shifts from the introspective, self-conscious idea of who I am to a more expressive, creative, participatory nature of who we are. So we shift from this idea of a separate self into a shared identity.
Man.
And in that circle, Kaukelo, we are aware that I am a man and I'm a woman and I'm anything else. But once that circle begins, we become participants in creating a society that we want, where individual identities do not matter. And that minimizes violence. That minimizes violence against individuals and members of society. And this is why there's very little gender-based violence in some of these societies. There's very little violence against children in a lot of these societies. Because we have shifted then from an intellectualizing identity to an expressive, creative identity. Because now we are creating something together. We're not defensive, we are not reactive, we are participating. So we can learn the best practices from going backwards and looking for these ways in which we can gather, tell our stories, dance, and celebrate. And what this does is to move the conversation from happiness. We always talk about the pursuit of happiness. That's very American, right?
Yep.
My proposal is that these African ways of gathering, storytelling and playing and dancing and singing around the fire, they're very, very primal and elemental. In there, we're not pursuing happiness. Happiness is temporary. The pursuit of happiness can usually be kind of a zero-sum game. If I'm not happy, then you should not be happy too, right? So if I'm not happy, then you should not be happy. And if you are happy, then you're taking away my happiness. So it becomes a zero-sum game. What these African orientations and approaches can give us is the pursuit of joy and delight. So a joy-oriented self-definition, a delight-oriented self-orientation shifts from scarcity to abundance. There's enough joy for all of us. Your joy is not dependent on my absence of joy. Your delight is not at the expense of mine. It's a shared joy. It's a shared delight. And that's why when you come to visit me in this particular studio, in this my office, I'm delighted.
Yeah.
I'm delighted to host you because our joy is shared. My joy does not take away from your capacity for joy.
Man.
When we share the joy and the delight around this conversation, we expand it. We do not diminish it. And so when we use these circles of conversation, of expression, of co-creation, of creating a society together, men's joy will not be diminished at the expense of women's joy, or whatever other genders that we can incorporate in there, and all kind of genderifications that we have, right? So we're not playing a zero-sum game. So in that space, feminism is not in opposition to masculinity.
Man,
and that conversation, that oppositional conversation disappears. We're creating together.
It's not you, it's and.
Yeah.
Right? It's both.
It's both
me
and. Yeah.
It's not us against them.
Exactly.
Yes, sir. Oh, man. And you mentioned these 3 practices. And it's fascinating now when I make the link to the work you do in music psychotherapy, right? Where gathering, dancing, and storytelling are very much a part of music or music culture as far as we experienced it as Black people. Come then to my world of hip-hop where a cypher brought together different groups, different generations, different industries, different language, everything. But we all came in there, and for the moment, we were all together. We were co-creating. And there's a lot of beauty that comes out of that, right? All the beef, all the drama that happened between such and such a friend disappears. Like we're all part of a collective. So when you think of men and men being, when you think of dancing and you're like, I don't want to dance, you know. There's even songs about, I go to a party, I don't even dance. You know? But now we're forgetting that, sure, it's not dance to show off your skills, but it's dance to celebrate yourself and to express yourself.
Exactly.
So how do you see now music therapy now going to help men, right? How can we take some learnings or some teachings from your experience with music therapy into, hey, guys, let's gather now. Here's a drum. Who can play? You know, I've never played a drum. Well, I mean, by now I have, but I don't have any real training with playing drums. But you can give me a drum, you know, whatever's in my heart will come out.
Exactly.
Right? And I'm not thinking about who's watching me, who's listening, is my rhythm on point? No, I'm expressing from the soul.
100%. And that's why when we shift from intellectual introspective practices to expressive and creative practices, it doesn't matter whether I consider myself a good dancer, a good singer. Those things don't matter in that space. And you mentioned the hip-hop culture. When one comes into the hip-hop culture, to move it there, it doesn't matter whether one can freestyle or not. One of the characteristics of being in the hip-hop culture is that you come in to participate. There's some guys who walk into the hip-hop circle and the only thing they do is to set a mic. So there's always space for everyone. There's room for everyone to participate. The important thing is you are there. Maybe yours is to create a stage. Maybe it's to manage a stage. Maybe it's to manage an artist. Maybe it's to coach an artist in voice. So there's always something there. So participation is far more important than excellence. We can pursue excellence within that particular space. We can want to get things right within that particular space, but that's not the most important thing. Right? So learning from those cultures, from the hip-hop culture, from the African cultures, from the artistic expressions of African cultures, it always comes down to inclusion, diversity, participation, creativity, and expression. How that is done is not really very important. In African music, everywhere, everyone is considered a musician. So African music does not consider virtuosos. Right? Everyone participates. When you are at a music performance, you can participate either as an observer. An observer is a participant, either by clapping your hands or stomping your feet or singing in whatever voice that you're able to add to the singing. So there's always participation at multiple levels. And this is important because it lessens overly intellectualizing and trying to understand myself in this particular space, and it reduces self-consciousness, right? Yes. So we're able to celebrate ourselves in that space and welcome ourselves. We can exercise self-hospitality in that space. So as a person who is exercising hospitality to myself, I invite myself in. So I'm at once a host and a guest in this particular conversation.
Man, that's so powerful, man. And I want to now latch on to a different point now. Now we're talking about everyone contributing in their own unique way, right? But so often now, and maybe it's got to do with the time that we're in, there's always one person who wants to stand out, right? Whereas I believe that in our cultures, the person who stood out had some kind of experience, some kind of spiritual growth, and, you know, the elders would know, like, he's ready, right?
Yes.
But now, in our society now, we choose someone not based on spiritual growth or any of that. We choose it based on KG's got 2 million followers. So I'm sure if he says something on mental health, people are going to listen to him. So you're talking about the different voices that we're using to sort of portray the message around taking care of yourself and being mentally healthy, right? What do you think about that whole concept that we now kind of going for the celebrity? And no offense to you guys out there. You know, I think there's a good reason you're doing what you do. But we go for the celebrity, whereas there's someone who's got a much better lived experience or much better understanding to share with the world that could impact a lot more people. So, of course, people might not know that person, and that's why they go for the celebrity. But what do you think that does to just the general public? Are we spreading the right message even in telling these celebrities to talk about their own personal experience without really considering how that impacts on the next person, you know.
There's something to be said about celebrities running with some of these messages, and also critiquing. We need to critique that and where that comes from. It comes from a social structure that is hierarchical. And it puts a few individuals on a pedestal, and then we shoot them, right? Now, that doesn't create a society that we want, right? If we want to create a society that we want, we need to be all hands on deck.
Yep.
All of us must take our responsibility. We must take our responsibility. And that's the African way, I think, is that everyone is invited to take responsibility. It's the ground up approach as opposed to the top down approach. You know, a single celebrity, a single person is not going to do the work that all of us are supposed to be doing, right? So a single person is not going to absorb us of our responsibility to create a society that we want. And that's why democratization of the processes, you know, people talk about Africa as if Africa was never democratic. To the contrary, Africa was always democratic because work was always shared equitably, right? According to people's strengths, skill levels, you know, levels of growth and development. And you mentioned that somebody was identified by the community to hold certain responsibilities. The community identified as opposed to individuals identifying themselves. Because when you identify yourself, you're putting yourself in a situation where the expectations of the society might be a bit too heavy for you, and you might crumble and fall. Right? Whereas when the community identifies you as a bearer of the community's knowledge and wisdom, the community stands to support you.
Yes, man.
They hold you, they support you because they know you are carrying the burden with them and not on their behalf. You're carrying it with them. And that's why the sangomas were always identified by people within the community because of their giftedness. The giftedness was identified by the community. And people knew that they are going to hold it with them, not for the community. Right? So people did support you in carrying out your responsibilities. Right, so the shrine presiders were identified by the community, and they were supported in their exercise of duty when duty called them to do so. Right. So something that earlier that I wanted to mention, alongside that is, and this segues into that very very neatly, is the role of initiation. Right? So a lot of the initiatory practices do take into account the things that we've just mentioned here. The community identifies what your skills are, and not just once, but over your life course. They see how you're growing up in the community, and they identify certain aspects about you as an individual. And a lot of African cultures did have initiations for men as well, for boys as well. And we have simplified our understanding of initiations these days. And to an extent, initiation practices have become exclusive as opposed to inclusive as they were. You know, so the exclusion, the exclusive part was only a small part of initiation. The initiatory process was always done within the community, which some scholars have identified as, like Victor Turner, who was notably, he was an anthropologist for many years, who studied initiation ceremonies and and just not just the initiation of men and boys, but just right across the lifespan, he understood that the part of the initiation is the experience of communitas. That we go into this space where we experience community that teaches us what it actually means to take on the responsibility of being whatever our assignment is in that particular community. If you are assigned to be a man of a particular kind in that particular community, you are assigned to be responsible in a particular way, not to take away the fact that you're going to be exercising certain duties. It doesn't take away from other responsibilities that are assigned to other people. Right? So it's not a zero-sum game. It's not your responsibilities being at the expense of other people's responsibilities. But this is learned within a community. It's not learned as individuals.
Yes.
So community becomes really important, that we hold each other, we hold each other to the responsibilities that we assign for each other. Those that are assigned by the community to individuals, the community stands to hold them.
Man, that's so powerful, man. And, you're talking about initiation, and, a lot of it, people would say, like, men are the way they are today because of initiation is no longer there, right? We're not showing boys what it means to build a community up, like you say. We're not showing boys what it means to marry, how that contributes back into the community, not just your personal sexual explorations, not just your own, I want to build a family, but more like to everyone. What is this whole initiation about? So when you talk about initiation has gone kind of exclusive, is it now the role of elders to sort of rectify that, to speak to the current teachers or trainers or initiators, to say that, hey, we're witnessing a pattern of this school of ours or the school of thought of ours going a bit this way, but traditionally, and we touched on this earlier, right? So I guess my question is, I see a disconnect between the generations, and whose responsibility should we make it to close that? Is it from both generations?
Borrowing from the Eastern wisdom, right? In the Buddhist tradition. And this was always present in the African wisdom tradition as well.
Yeah.
In the Buddhist tradition, they say that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And this was always present in the African wisdom as well, because one, there was a ubiquity, there was a presence, an abundance of wisdom figures. And so young people had learned how to communicate when they were ready to be initiated, when they were ready to be mentored, when they were ready to be accompanied by an adult, by an elder. And the elders were present and they were ready. They knew when the student was ready to be accompanied, to be initiated, to be taught.
Yes, yes.
We have a problem of elders at the moment. One is because we don't have as many elders.
True.
For so many reasons. Like we mentioned, we have an issue of cultural trauma. By cultural trauma, I mean that there was a mutilation of the African culture, and when there's a mutilation of a culture, the transmissibility, there's almost a disjointed development. There's an arrested development of that culture. There are quite a number of things that happened over the years because of colonialism. So colonialism came and told us that African cultures were primitive, and so we needed to disconnect ourselves from African cultures, right? And that connected with that was what I call missionarism,
Sure.
where lots of missionary activities that were very explicit about telling African people to repent from the pagan ways, right? So part of the so-called salvation and so-called redemption from African ways that were demonized was public. It was public so-called conversions, right? And part of those conversions were to renounce your allegiances to your African cultures and African traditions, right? So we were actively discouraged from participating in anything that was of African wisdom and tradition and culture.
Yeah.
And then there was also over the years the diseases that destroyed the whole generations of people. So there was evolutionary disconnection of the transfer of African wisdoms and practices and all of that. So, and then the economic structures and the economic systems that we have adopted that have concentrated most people into urbanized areas that have disconnected us from African traditions and cultures. So we have a generation of elders that have very little understanding of the nuances and the depth of African cultures and practices. And this is why it's important for us to invite scholars to do in-depth studies and harvesting of the best of African cultures. Not the things that we've been taught that African cultures are.
Sure.
The things that have been demonized over the years. You know, this is not to say that we need to go back and celebrate without critical thinking, without critiquing the African thought and all of that. And we've got scholars that are rising up and saying, no, we need to be a bit more critical about Africanity and all of that. And yes, we need, and this is where we need scholars who are going to raise questions about the best practices coming from African wisdoms so that we can harvest those, educate ourselves as a people. We need to continue to educate ourselves as a people so that we're not picking smoke from the fire of African traditions. So I am committed to doing a lot of the study, the scholarly study of Africanity so that we can use that in the work that we want to do, right? So the question of raising elders falls in the cracks, as you can see. The elders that we have now are understudied, they're undereducated, they're underinitiated. And what do you expect from such elders who themselves have very little understanding of what it means to be a participating adult in initiation and in creating a society that we want? And this is what exactly we're talking about. Initiation is about a community participating collectively in creating a future. Initiations were exactly about that, about we are creating in these rituals, in these sessions, in these experiences, we are creating a future that we want by teaching these young people, boys and girls, in different settings, what it means to be participants in a society that we want. That's what initiations were. They were educative. They were instructive. They were inductive. There were places where young people were trained what it means to contain psychological discomfort, so that I don't snap at the quickest moment when I'm supposed to be holding the psychological tensions and the disagreements in interactions with other people.
Man, oh, that's so beautiful. And that's why you say, like, we wouldn't have none of these issues, GBV, any of these.
100%.
Because you know your limits, right?
You know your limits.
Man. So now, it seems like when we talk initiations, we only focus on the circumcision part of it, right? But it's like, okay, what else can we talk about? Why I say that, there's a study or that film that came out, I think it was Iqeba or something like that. And there was a big debate around that, right? And the elders from that, I think it was the Zulu tribe, if I'm not mistaken, or close, I'm not sure. I'll get that right. And we'll link that article too as well, just for people who want to read about it. How they felt like, wait, but now you sharing our secrets with the world on TV. These are meant to be kept within our community, right? Not being kept out of everyone, but we're not really showing that stuff. That stuff needs to be contained in a certain place. But with the growth of media and people wanting to understand culture and what goes on there, are we doing the right thing by showing our cultures in that way? Is there a need for the rest of the world to understand what goes on in our initiation process? And what is the fascination? Why is the fascination only with the circumcision? And why not so much on everything else that gets taught there? Because I've just learned a lot from just sitting here with you, like about initiation. I honestly thought you go get chopped off, you sit in the mountains with a couple of men, they tell you what they tell you, and you back home, you're a man, right?
Exactly. So that comes from a reductionist science-based inquiry, right? So in that sense, it becomes we become so obsessed with narrow facts. So the circumcision itself becomes a fascination because it's easy, we can see it.
Sure.
Because the other stuff is a bit more complex for us to understand because it's nuanced, it's symbolic, it's more process-based as opposed to result-based or product-based. So these are the things that are happening underground. They are capturing the essence of the meaning of our existence. So when we discuss rituals, it's important for us to understand that there's the observable stuff, and then there's the intangible, unobservable, qualitative stuff that remains unsayable, unspeakable, and that has nothing to do with secrets. It has a lot to do with the meaning that is held in those experiences. It's because what we call secrets are actually things that we know we cannot explicate. We cannot explain to anybody else apart from the fact that I know this experience and what it means to me.
Sure.
Right?
It's a very personal
It's a very personal experience.
Sure.
So when I go through some kind of initiation, whether it's emotional initiation, whatever, when I come out on the other side of the experience, it's like I've walked through fire. And I come out on the other side. If somebody said to me, what was it like? And I was like, I don't know. But I know I'm a different person from the person that started the journey on the other side of the fire hole. So there are certain things, even at an emotional level, there are certain things we go through and you come out on the other side and you're like, gee, I don't even know how I survived through that. Can't explain it. And initiations are like that. And the obsessions with the facts and wanting to know what exactly happens in there, they cloud us from seeing and from really imagining the experience itself and understanding what the initiation is really about, which is about not just the formation of individual masculinities in this case that we're discussing men, but it's about forming a wholesome person who is trained to be a participant in a society that we are creating together. And that calls for a lot more imagination than obsession with a single fact that my foreskin is cut off. The cutting of the foreskin is only a symbolic act.
Sure.
Right,
Sure.
that invites me. It's like in the Christian circles, it's like baptism. Right? It's a single. They call it a sacrament in the Catholic Church. I think it's called a sacrament. And what is a sacrament? They talk about a visible action of an invisible reality.
Oh man.
So a visible act of an invisible reality, and so. The cutting of the foreskin is like a sacrament.
Yes, man. You know, I'm now fascinated about myth and the power of myth, and what you're saying right now is why we need that, right?
100%.
The myth gives us reason to live. You know, there's a lot of mythology in the Bible. So is our culture, right? Full of myth. And as much as people will try to explain the Bible in intellectual terms, like you're saying, you just won't get it.
You don't get it. You won't
because
get it.
It's got nothing to do with the smarts of a person, but it's got everything to do with like the spiritual, I guess, setting, the spiritual place that you're at. And then you understand some parts, and then some parts will be revealed to you when you are ready as a student, like you say.
Exactly.
Magical, man. So, you know, in that light, is it worth even preserving myths and carrying on those myths through storytelling, which we don't have now as much as we used to? How can we carry that on in today's society?
So there's an invitation for us, and going back, we're coming almost full circle, right? Coming back to that invitation that I put across, rather than focusing on the 4th and 5th approaches to conversations. Let's rather look at ways in which we can invite ourselves to dance, to storytelling. Because once we get into that realm, we're into the realm of myth. Right? Who are our current storytellers?
Man, right now it's...
You are a storyteller.
Right now.
Through this podcast, right? You're a storyteller. And we need people like you. We need more storytellers like yourself. We need more storytellers in the realm of therapists and psychologists and scholars, researchers, university people. We need storytellers, not just people who are interested in facts.
Yes, man.
We need storytellers, people that can tell us stories. Not just a myth is not a story about what happened in the past, right? A myth is a story that encapsulates in itself answers about where we're coming from, what it means for us to be here, where we are going, and why it matters for us to perpetuate our existence.
Man.
And a myth is something that we can create together. Again, when we create a good myth, we create a good society.
Man.
When we create a good story, we create a good society. So our participation in myth creation, in myth development, invites us to participate in dance, in storytelling, in creating the society. Again, we're back there. A society our hearts know is possible. So a myth is a story of our life, is the story of our existence. That tells us how we want to exist, how we want to relate, how we want to know each other,
Yes,
how we want to live forever.
Man.
You know, so we need a good story. And we need a good way of each of us participating in that story.
Oh, man. Dr. Nsamu, man. This is, I'm fascinated by just like your ability to pull from different pockets of knowledge, if I may put it, and, I want to have this, I'm probably going to bother you quite often to say, man, we got to do another one. But one question that I kind of always leave to the end, I try to remember it as much as I can, but, there's one thing that all of us can do. We can do something, and when I look at my friends, when I look at men in society and what's being said about us, as opposed to how we act and how we treat each other, there's a huge difference there, right? But there's always, like I say, the one thing that we could do better or more of, right? So I think I spoke to Michael Unbroken, who was like, man, you can tell your friend that you love them and don't make it awkward. You don't have to say that, no homo, none of that stuff, right? You can, I think Lekgetho had said, give another man a hug and mean it, Someone said, pray for your friends. And I thought, man, that's powerful, because I've had someone recently who I spoke to on the phone, never met the man. And at the end of our call, he said, man, do you mind if I pray for you? And I found that very profound. It's like I told him, never happened ever in my life. And I appreciate that. And that's something that I want to do for certain people, right? So in your realm, man, in the men that you meet, in the spaces that you occupy and the people that you help, what could be the one thing that you could say you want to see more of, us passing on to the next generation, or just being cordial with each other as men? What would it be?
I want to see more of men tapping into our joy and delight. And I want to see more men gathering to sing and dance and ritualize. And this is why I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, maybe the next thing that we do together, Kaukelo, is put a ritual together.
Oh, man.
That we could record and put it out, maybe a series of rituals.
I would love that.
Gathering men who are interested. Men out there, if you're interested, get in touch with Kaukelo or get in touch with me. We've got spaces. Let's create these spaces ourselves, and let's not wait for somebody else to do it for us. Let's create these spaces. I think we can do something. Like this is a ritual that we've just had now. Right. This conversation is a ritual. Right. Just having a conversation, gathering. I mean, it's two of us here, but a few more people are going to be listening to this conversation. Yes, but even those who are listening are participating in this ritual that we have created together. But it would be interesting for us to do a ritual.
I would love that. I would love that.
I would love that. We can work towards it, get some people that will be interested in being part of this, and we go all in. And it's not for any cause apart from just ourselves in it, experiencing ourselves and making meaning for ourselves and for our lives.
Oh, I would love that, man. So, are you guys hearing that? We're gonna package that into something to share with you guys on the socials, just for those who don't get it. But man, if you're listening to this and you wanna be part of that experience with us, we'll build an offering and we'll share it with you, man. But Dr. Nsamu, this has been, man, exceptionally informative for me. I feel at home, man. I'm about to just sit on this couch for the rest of the day and play on these drums or something, But I drove all the way here, and I was listening to some music that just to get me centered and grounded. And man, I think what I listened to directed all the thoughts that we had here in this conversation, and all the prep that I brought, I actually just chucked it to the side and I went with what you have. So
and exactly that's what happens when you have, it happens for me too when I'm having a good conversation, when the conversation is really deep and mythical. And it because a good conversation, to quote one mythologist in the name of John O'Donoghue, said, a good conversation leaves you asking yourself the question, how did I get here?
Man.
You know? And this is what I've experienced now. I also didn't think this conversation was going to go where it has gone.
Yeah.
And I'm glad it has. Yeah. Because I think it has invited me as well to think about all the ways in which I can reflect on my own masculinity and reflect on my own evolution as a person, as a man, as an African man, as a black man, as a black male, who has a story, who has a myth, who has some of the wisdom coming from our own African wisdom traditions.
Yes. This has been way too informative. Make sure you follow us on social media. As always, make sure you like the episode, man. Make sure you share it. Make sure you follow Dr. Nsamu as well. I'm going to share his details and all the stuff that we spoke about that we promised we'll put in the show notes. Speak to people, man. Sing, dance, get together in those groups. Build your own myths, man. Who knows what might come out of it? You know, build a better society for the children coming after you, for the children who are living that you've brought into this world, but more importantly, for yourself and your family. It's been another insightful episode of Manned Up Conversations. Catch you on the flip side. Peace and love.